Here's a quick list of some amazing facts for you. The noise of a jet plane is not louder than that of a piston-driven kind. A giraffe's front legs are not longer than its hind legs. Water can run uphill. It was once possible to obtain a divorce by merely turning a crank. Fish can be trained to answer to their names. Cinderella's slipper was not glass. Wireless was discovered 20 years before Marconi. Fulton did not invent the steamboat. Some sheep wear cotton coats. A Queen of England was never in England. And there is no Indian head on an Indian head penny. This is just a tiny sampling of the hundreds of amazing facts in this volume. Welcome back. This is Jeff Hicks, curator of the Strange As It Seems archives and grandnephew of John Hicks, who created Strange As It Seems back in the late 1920s. For today's episode, we're going to go back into really a second episode of amazing facts and stories in this book, the first of 3 books published by my grandmother, Elsie Hicks, who took over Strange As It Seems in 1948 when her husband, my grandfather, Ernest Hicks, died in a plane crash. He had been running the comic strip for about 4 years after my great-uncle John died, strange as it seems, on D-Day, but had nothing to do with the war. He had died of myocarditis, I guess an inflammation of the heart. But this is about 7 years in to Elsie Hicks running the comic strip. Now, keep in mind, nobody ever made any money at Strange As It Seems. This was never a huge money-making endeavor. It had a pretty big heyday in the 30s and 40s. There were about 150 Universal Film shorts produced. I have a few of those here on the YouTube channel, as well as about 600 CBS radio broadcasts, and I have several of those, many of those. In fact, we'll touch on some of the stories in here that did turn into radio shows later on in the episode. But really an amazing story. My grandmother was compiling a lot of the stories that had been researched over the 20 or so years before she took over the comic strip, but she was also finding stories every day on her own. She'd work as an executive secretary by day, all day long, come home at night. She had 2 kids, my father and my Aunt Dixie, and she would take care of the kids, do all that, research all night, putting the stories together, drop them off in the morning to the artist, George Johns, who was the artist at the time. And then she'd go back to work. She did this really 7 days a week, including the Sunday comics, for almost 20 years. So really a labor of love, which again, I'm doing years later here at Strange As It Seems, continuing that labor of love, going back into the family archives and telling some of the greatest stories. So today, we'll go back in to more stories from the 1953, the first of 3 books by Elsie Hicks here at Strange As It Seems. I'll start off with some of the stories that I remember as a kid. A lot of the kids in my family remember getting this book from my grandmother and my father. There were a couple of boxes of these books in the archives, these hardcover Elsie Hicks books. And I remember just going over and over this book and all the stories in it. One of my favorite stories took place on Mount Baldy, as we knew it. It's actually Mount San Antonio formerly, but this is I grew up in San Marino, California, under the shadow of Mount Baldy, and I remember this story as the most accurate yardstick on Earth. The world's most accurate tape measure is the 22-mile baseline between the U.S. government geodetic stations on Mount Wilson and Mount San Antonio, Old Baldy, in Southern California. The distance was measured to assist astronomers in determining the velocity of light, and it is exact within the astounding figure of only 1 part in 6,800,000, or 0.2 of an inch for the 22 miles, made by the most skillful engineers and mathematicians of the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. It represents the greatest degree of accuracy ever arrived at by triangulation and by the use of the finest instruments known to science. Of course, this is 1953. In measuring the baseline, innumerable obstacles had to be met and overcome. Parts of the survey were possible through the air. Where this made the task impossible, such as in forest areas, the calculations were arrived at mathematically. At various places along the 22 miles, the experts had to run their line across the tops of trees of immense orange groves, once the line passed in and out of the windows of a dwelling. Some of the most serious sources of error to be encountered in a project of this nature are alignment, grade, temperature, tension, contacts, and friction. Nearby mountain masses, deep valleys, and buried structure also tend to cause error, all of which should give the layman at least an idea of the problems that were involved and solved in creating the most accurate yardstick in the world. And I remember coming across this story a little bit later in life. It always fascinated me. I came to learn that actually back in the summer of 1926, an experimental beam of light had pierced the sky between these 2 points, and science history was actually made here. It was obviously unseen by those below, the population centers below, but the beam was a key element of Dr. Albert Michelson's revolutionary experiments that was at the time the most accurate measurement of the speed of light. They were performed in this most accurate yardstick between 1924 and 1927, and it was kind of the culmination of Michelson's remarkable 40-year career in the study of physics. And as the story goes, Michelson devised an ingenious yet relatively simple method for measuring the speed of light. A beam of light was projected from the Mount Wilson site to a return mirror on Lookout Mountain, which is on Mount Baldy, and the returning beam hit a rotating mirror assembly at Mount Wilson. The speed of light measurement was obtained by measuring the minute changes to the angle of the light when it was reflected off the rotating mirror. Michelson's historic experiments in the San Gabriel Mountains provided the first accurate measurements of the speed of light and helped to pave the way for Albert Einstein to develop his revolutionary theory of relativity. In 1931, Einstein praised Michelson's efforts in a speech at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech as we knew it, in Pasadena, stating, "Without your work, this theory would today be scarcely more than an interesting speculation." Strange as it seems. And the second story I remember from this book as a kid, I also saw at the Smithsonian Institute, the museum. I used to go with my father every summer. My grandmother, Elsie, actually lived in Washington, D.C. when I was growing up. Her husband built the Kenwood Golf and Country Club there, and my grandmother, even after he passed, lived in an apartment there at Kenwood. And my dad and I would go to the Smithsonian, and I remember seeing this dog at the Smithsonian, and remember connecting it to the story here, amazing story of the most traveled dog in the world. His name was Owney. A little dog of uncertain parentage, the special friend of postal clerks all over the United States, traveled around the world and was given a Medal of Honor by the Japanese Emperor. In the winter of 1888, a friendless, shivering dog wandered into the post office at Albany, New York. He cuddled up on a pile of warm mailbags and went to sleep. Found by the postal clerks, he shared their lunch, gained their affection, and was given a brand new collar on which was placed the name Owney. Curious as to where the mailbags went, Owney got on a truck and made a round trip to New York. This developed the gypsy in him, and he started on a tour of America. This up and down across the country he went, happy to be with his dearest friends, the postal clerks, who regarded it as an honor to have Owney as their guest. They regarded him as an omen of good luck, for no mail car on which Owney ever traveled had an accident. To the dog's collar were attached tags, medals, inscriptions, and post office marks from nearly every state in the Union until a special harness had to be made for them. He visited Mexico, Canada, and Alaska, and from Tacoma, Washington, he sailed aboard the Victoria to Japan, where he received a Medal of Honor from the Japanese Emperor. In China, he was also given a great ovation. At the end of his globe-wide travels, Owney was given a reception and a silver medal on which was inscribed, "The greatest dog traveler in the world." And when Owney died, his body was mounted and, together with all of his decorations, placed in the Smithsonian Institution. Strange as it seems. And for the third story, another one I remember as a kid, mostly because in class, I remember often challenging my teachers by these stories that I would learn in Strange as It Seems that were really ran in reverse to what people always thought. Things like George Washington was the first president. Well, he wasn't. He was the 8th president. And I remember challenging my teacher and actually proving my fact, or that Thomas Edison didn't invent the light bulb. And this was another one that appeared in my grandmother's book, and it's about the first steamboat. If somebody suddenly asked you who invented the steamboat, you would probably say Robert Fulton, which is what we were taught in school. But you would be wrong. The inventor was John Fitch of Bardstown, Kentucky, a young lieutenant in General Washington's Continental Army who was Washington's gunsmith at Valley Forge. Fitch piloted his steamboat down the Delaware River, the famous painting, Washington crossing the Delaware, which actually, you got to check out the radio show below about Washington crossing the Rhine. Strange story there. But back to this one. He piloted his steamboat down the Delaware River from Philadelphia to Burlington, New Jersey, a distance of 20 miles in 1790, 17 years before Fulton's Clermont steamed down the Hudson. Thousands of people lined the banks of the Delaware to witness Fitch's first public demonstration of his prodigious contribution to world progress. In conceding Fitch credit for the steamboat's invention, the secretary of the Pennsylvania Historical Society said, "The country has too long neglected to honor the man whose genius was used in perfecting the first means of moving seacraft by steam." A fresco mural in the Capitol in Washington now portrays Fitch as the inventor, and over Fitch's grave at Bardstown, Kentucky, where the inventor died, a broken-hearted man is a monument in his honor, erected by an appropriation of $15,000 from Congress. Fitch was a many-sided artisan, displaying his skill as a silversmith and watchmaker, as well as a gunsmith. In his gun factory, making arms for General Washington, as many as 60 people were employed. And there is no indication that Robert Fulton attempted in any way to assume the honor that rightfully belonged to Fitch. He simply took over Fitch's expired patents after the inventor had died, made improvements, and began to manufacture the steamboat for commercial purposes. Strange as it seems, when Fitch conceived the idea of the steam-propelled boat, which came to him after the war, when he was in the watchmaking business, he had never even seen a steam engine. For the next 3 stories, I was a little bit inspired recently by my nephew Lucas, who is now a submariner in the Navy. He just joined a couple of years ago. And there are actually 3 stories in this book that all have to do with submarines. The first one is the amazing USS Tang. Unsurpassed in the annals of the U.S. submarine service was the record made in World War II by the gallant Tang. No other U.S. submarine sank as many ships during a single patrol. She sank 10 merchant ships in 2 weeks and was twice awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. She sank a total of 24 enemy vessels and, serving as a lifeguard, had 22 rescues to her credit. In 1944, setting out on her 5th war patrol, which was officially described as the most successful patrol ever made by a U.S. submarine, she encountered a Japanese convoy of tankers and troop ships in the Formosa Strait. Commander O'Kane sent his ship charging straight at her attackers. He fired 3 fast shots to clear the way. The first struck a tanker, which promptly spewed a geyser of flame. The second stopped a transport dead in the water, and the third struck a destroyer with a thunderclap that shook the Tang from stem to stern. Sprinting through the gap, the Tang dashed away from the Jap DEs. Commander O'Kane held his ship at a safe distance while the last 2 torpedoes were loaded in the tubes. Resuming the fight, he gave the order to fire the first torpedo at the transport, then the second. Instantly, the lookout stared in cold shock. The missile swerved sharply to the left, did a hairpin turn and a circular run, and headed straight for the Tang. Her destruction is vividly described by Theodore Roscoe in his book, History of the U.S. Submarine Operations in World War II. Mr. Roscoe reports that the night was livid with the glare of burning ships, spitting guns, tracer bullets, and exploding shells. The blast flung Commander O'Kane and 8 of his men from the bridge. Mortally stricken, Tang plunged 180 feet to the bottom. The survivors were picked up by a Japanese destroyer escort subjected to great cruelty and eventually were placed in Japanese prison camps, from which they were recovered at the end of the war. In the citation awarding the Congressional Medal of Honor to Commander O'Kane was the tribute which read, in part, "This is the saga of the greatest submarine cruise of all time, the 5th and last war patrol of Tang, ably led by her illustrious, gallant, and courageous commanding officer and his crew of daring officers and men. So lived and so died the heroic Tang, victim of her own last torpedo, strange as it seems." And for another amazing story about a U.S. submarine, here's the story of the U.S. submarine Devilfish. Off Iwo Jima on March 20th, 1945, U.S. submarine Devilfish sighted a Japanese plane diving from the clouds astern. Theodore Roscoe gives the following account in his book, which we cited just earlier, History of U.S. Submarine Operations in World War II, Devilfish, made a fast dive, and while 50 feet underwater, her men heard an explosion which sounded like a light bomb some distance away. A moment later, water poured in through the bottom of the SJ mast. Working desperately, the men managed to funnel the water into the periscope well, but the damage was considerable. When Lieutenant Commander S.S. Mann Jr. ordered his craft to surface that night, some scrap and a bit of junk which looked like a plane's landing gear were found on the Devilfish's deck and bridge. It had not occurred to captain or crew that their submarine had been the target of a kamikaze, a Japanese suicide attack. But here was evidence that, for once at least, the anvil had unknowingly demolished the hammer. It's the only known instance of its kind. The Devilfish was credited with the destruction of an enemy plane while 50 feet under the sea, strange as it seems. And for the third and final submarine story, this one's an amazing fact, because you always think of Pearl Harbor as that morning when everybody woke up and the surprise attack came with kamikaze planes and all the planes attacking Pearl Harbor. But the first shot at Pearl Harbor actually occurred in the early morning hours of December 7th, 1941, when the USS Condor, a minesweeper, nearly collided with a small submarine in the defensive sea area of Pearl Harbor. The Ward, an old-type destroyer, began a search, but without success until it received directions from the USS Antares, which the submarine seemed to be trailing. The Ward picked up the trail. A Navy PBY circled the area and dropped 2 smoke pots to mark the sub's location. And at 6:30, the Ward opened point-blank fire. The second shot punctured the conning tower, and the sub heeled over and sank and was finished off with depth charges. 8 minutes later, the Ward sent the following message to the Commandant, 14th Naval District. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area." So, the Japanese attack did not come until 7:55 a.m. So, strange as it seems, and contrary to popular belief, on that fateful morning of December 7th, 1941, 1 hour and 25 minutes before the Japanese plane attacks, the first shot at Pearl Harbor was fired at and not by the attacking Japanese. There were also a few stories in my grandma Elsie's first published book that she pulled from the greatest hits of the previous decades that were actually featured in radio shows. So I won't tell those stories here other than to tease them because they were better told, I think, by the classic radio broadcasts of the late 1930s and even into the 1940s. The first of which is an owl's testimony. The words of an owl were actually accepted in a federal court as testimony in a murder trial. Check that story out. And another crazy story that ended up a radio show. I'm actually going to publish it, I think, in the next week or two. I'm going through about a series of 60 radio shows that I found, but it's called Washington Crossing the Rhine. And it's dear to the heart of every true American is the well-known painting of General George Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas Day, 1776. But strange as it seems, no part of the picture is American. Amazing story, also a radio show below. Check it out here in the Strange As It Seems Classics. And for the final story in today's episode, there was a church once built from one tree, and there's actually more to the story than had occurred by the time my grandmother wrote about it, which we'll tell at the end here. But strange as it seems, the congregation was not told that they were in possession of a house of worship that would be known the world over as the church built from one tree. We're happily surprised when the fact was made public through the newspapers when the church was completed. The First Baptist Church in Santa Rosa, California, erected in 1873, was constructed from the lumber of one giant redwood, which grew near Guerneville, California, and the church stands not far from where the tree was felled. Making the church out of a single tree was the idea of a millman in Guerneville who provided the lumber. The tree, when sawed, yielded 78,000 feet of lumber. The church, Gothic in style, has a main auditorium 60 by 37 feet with a seating capacity of 300. When the afternoon sun shines through the art glass window of the church, it reflects in beautifully illuminated letters, rich in color, the words, "The church built from one tree." But there was more to this story than my grandma knew at the time in 1953, because the building was actually repurposed by Robert Ripley of Ripley's Believe It or Not, who's the main competitor of Strange As It Seems back in the day. But he was a native of Santa Rosa, and he wrote about the Church of One Tree, where his mother actually attended services. And in one of his earliest installments of Believe It or Not, the comic strip, which was about 9 years older than Strange As It Seems. But in 1970, when Strange As It Seems basically ended its run in newspapers, that's when my father and my mother basically closed it down and wrapped up all the archives, which were in my garage. But the Church of One Tree was repurposed in 1970 as the Ripley Memorial Museum, which was stocked with oddities and curiosities and Believe It or Not memorabilia for about 2 decades. Today, I think it's just a public space that can be rented out. Strange as it seems. Well, that wraps up this week's episode. Mine from the 1953 volume, the first of 3 books written by my grandma Elsie Hicks in 1953. If you like content like this, the strange and unusual, comic strip archives, old radio shows, even films, check out more of the content here at Strange As It Seems. Hit the bell to subscribe. I publish an episode here every week. A mind from the archives, I dig back in and find all the strange and unusual facts about science, nature, art, literature, and so forth. But hit the bell to subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. We'd love to hear what you think. And I'll wrap this episode up and all future episodes in the words of my grandma Elsie, actually echoed from the words that John Hicks also had written at the end of his book. But it is the author's desire that this book will not only prove to be informative, but will also fulfill its mission to entertain its readers while delving into the strange world in which we live.